It was a perfectly ordinary Saturday morning in October 1991, the kind of day that feels safe and predictable in a small suburban town like Evergreen, Illinois. The air was crisp, the sky a clear blue, and the leaves on the maple trees lining the streets had just begun to turn. Families were out running errands, kids were bundled up in light jackets, and the local Value Mart supermarket was doing its usual weekend business. Sarah Thompson, 32, pulled her blue station wagon into the parking lot just after 10 a.m. In the back seat sat her 3-year-old son, Timmy, curly blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and a grin that could melt anyone's heart. Timmy was clutching his favorite red toy truck, making soft vroom-vroom sounds as Sarah unbuckled him from his car seat. She lifted him onto her hip for a moment, kissed the top of his head, and promised cookies if he was a good helper in the store. Inside Value Mart, everything felt normal. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the bakery's warm bread smell drifted through the aisles, and Timmy rode happily in the shopping cart, legs swinging, pointing at everything that caught his eye. Sarah moved through her list methodically. Milk, cereal, apples, diapers. In the cereal aisle, her purse vibrated. It was her sister Lisa calling from out of state. Lisa had been going through a painful divorce, and Sarah had promised to always pick up when she needed to talk. Sarah wedged the phone between her ear and shoulder, keeping one hand on the cart. "Hey, sis," she said softly, glancing down at Timmy, who was contentedly munching on a cracker she'd handed him. The conversation stretched on. Lisa needed to vent, and Sarah listened, offering quiet support. It was only a few minutes, 3, maybe 4 at most. When Sarah looked down again, the seat of the cart was empty. The cracker lay half-eaten on the floor. Timmy was gone. At first, she thought he'd simply climbed out and was hiding nearby. Toddlers do that. "Timmy!" she called, her voice still calm. No answer. She pushed the cart to the end of the aisle and looked both ways. Nothing. "Timmy!" Louder this time. Shoppers turned their heads. Sarah's heart began to race. She abandoned the cart and ran up one aisle and down another, calling his name over and over, her voice rising in pitch with every second that passed. She burst through the automatic doors into the parking lot, scanning rows of cars under the bright morning sun. "Timmy! Timmy! Where are you?" She checked under vehicles, behind tires, between parked cars. Nothing. Back inside, she found the store manager, barely able to get the words out. "My son, he's 3, he was right there. And now he's gone. Please call the police." Within minutes, the store loudspeakers crackled with announcements about a missing child. Employees fanned out. Customers stopped shopping to help look. But Timmy had vanished. No trace, no cry for help, no little boy wandering lost. Near the exits. Police arrived quickly. Officer Mike Harlan took Sarah's shaking statement while other units sealed the parking lot. Sarah could barely speak. "I only turned away for a minute. Just a phone call." Mark, Timmy's father, sped over from the garage where he worked, still in his grease-stained uniform. When he saw Sarah collapsed in tears against the station wagon, he knew something terrible had happened. Search dogs were brought in. They picked up Timmy's scent from his blanket in the car, followed it across the lot, and then the trail went cold at the edge of the asphalt. By early afternoon, volunteers were combing nearby streets and wooded areas. Flyers with Timmy's smiling face went up on every pole and storefront window in town. Local radio stations interrupted programming with alerts. As night fell, the parking lot lights buzzed on, casting long shadows over the yellow police tape. Hundreds of people had searched. Nothing had been found. Timmy Thompson, 3 years old, had disappeared in broad daylight in a busy supermarket parking lot in the space of a few minutes. Hey, if this story already has you hooked, and I know it does, please take a second to support the channel that brings you these deep dives into real unsolved cases. Hit that subscribe button on Unsolved Stories so you never miss an episode. Give this one a like if you're feeling the tension already, and most importantly, share it with someone who loves true crime as much as we do. Your shares help keep these stories alive and reach people who might have information that could one day make a difference. Thank you for being part of this community. We'll be right back with the frantic first hours and days of the search, when hope was still strong, but the clock was ticking mercilessly. The hours after Timmy's disappearance blurred into a nightmare that no one in Evergreen could have prepared for. By late afternoon on that Saturday, the Value Mart parking lot had transformed into a chaotic command center. Yellow police tape fluttered in the autumn wind, keeping curious onlookers at bay. Dozens of officers in uniform moved methodically between rows of cars, peering into windows, checking trunks that owners voluntarily opened, and marking tire tracks in the soft dirt along the edges of the asphalt. Helicopters thudded overhead, their searchlights sweeping the surrounding fields and wooded areas, even though daylight still lingered. Inside the store, detectives interviewed every employee who had been on shift: cashiers, stock boys, the bakery staff, anyone who might have seen something. One teenage bagger remembered seeing a small boy with blonde curls near the exit doors, holding the hand of a man in a dark jacket. But when pressed for details, the boy admitted he hadn't gotten a good look at the man's face. Another customer, an elderly woman named Gladys Carter, told police she'd noticed a white van parked crookedly near. The handicapped spots, engine running, driver inside. She thought it odd at the time, but hadn't seen anyone get in or out. Sarah sat in the back of a patrol car, wrapped in a blanket someone had brought her, staring blankly at the activity outside. Mark paced nearby, hands shoved deep in his pockets, occasionally stopping to ask officers for updates. Every time an officer approached, his face lit up with desperate hope, only to fall again when the news was, "Nothing yet." Sarah kept replaying those few minutes in her mind. The phone call, the cracker on the floor, the empty cart, over and over, like a loop she couldn't escape. As evening fell, the search expanded beyond the supermarket. Volunteer fire departments from neighboring towns arrived with floodlights and search dogs. Hundreds of residents showed up. Neighbors, church groups, even high school students who had heard the alerts on the radio. They formed lines and walked shoulder to shoulder through the tall grass. Behind the store, through drainage ditches, across the empty lots that bordered the railroad tracks. Someone brought coffee and donuts. Someone else set up a table with hot chocolate. Evergreen was a small, tight-knit community, and this was their child now, too. Detective Lieutenant Robert Klein, a 20-year veteran with a reputation for dogged persistence, was put in charge of the case. By 8 p.m., he held the first press conference on the edge of the parking lot. Cameras from local TV stations flashed as he spoke into a cluster of microphones. "We are treating this as a possible abduction," he said, his voice steady. "We have no reason to believe the child wandered off on his own. We are asking anyone who was in the Value Mart parking lot between 10 and 11 a.m. today to come forward, no matter how small the detail seems. We need your help." Timmy's photograph, a recent portrait showing him in a little denim overalls, grinning with one tiny tooth missing, was shown on every channel that night. Amber Alert systems were still in their infancy in 1991, but Illinois had just begun implementing a statewide emergency broadcast network. Timmy's description went out across radio and TV: 3 years old, 33 inches tall, 28 pounds, blonde curly hair, blue eyes, wearing a blue long-sleeve shirt with a dinosaur on the front, jeans, and tiny red sneakers. A tip line was established at the Evergreen Police Department. The phones began ringing immediately. The first credible call came just after midnight. A truck driver on Interstate 55, about 40 miles south, reported seeing a white van matching the partial description Gladys Carter had given: Illinois plates, rust along the bottom, speeding erratically and taking an exit toward a rural area. State troopers raced to the location, setting up roadblocks. For several tense hours, police stopped every white van in a 50-mile radius. None contained a little boy. Another call came from a woman in a neighboring suburb who swore she'd seen Timmy in the toy aisle of a Kmart that afternoon, holding a woman's hand. Police descended on the store, reviewed grainy security footage that showed nothing conclusive, and interviewed the woman. She eventually admitted she wasn't certain. It might have been a different child. By Sunday morning, the story had made national news. CNN ran a segment. Newspapers across the Midwest carried Timmy's photo on the front page. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children got involved, printing thousands of posters overnight. Mark and Sarah barely slept. They sat in their living room surrounded by family and friends, the phone ringing constantly with offers of help or prayers. Sarah's mother brewed endless pots of coffee. Someone brought casseroles. The house smelled of food no one could eat. On Monday, the FBI arrived. Two agents in dark suits met with Lieutenant Klein and began coordinating a wider investigation. They brought in profilers who suggested the abductor was likely someone who had been watching the store, possibly an opportunist who saw a moment when the mother was distracted. They stressed the importance of the golden hours, the first 48, knowing that statistically, the chances of recovering a child alive dropped sharply after that window. Search parties continued day and night. Divers dragged the retention pond behind the supermarket. Cadaver dogs were brought in as a precaution, a detail that made Sarah collapse in tears when she overheard it. Every wooded area within a 5-mile radius was gridded and walked. Nothing turned up. No red sneaker, no toy truck, no sign of struggle. The tip line became both a blessing and a curse. Calls poured in from across the country. Psychics phoned with visions of Timmy near water or in a house with blue shutters. Others claimed to have seen him in distant states, Florida, Texas, California. Each lead had to be checked, no matter how outlandish, because no one wanted to miss the one that mattered. One particularly cruel call came from a man who claimed to have Timmy and demanded $50,000 for his safe return. Police traced the call, arrested the man in a nearby town, and discovered it was a hoax. He'd seen the news and decided to exploit the family's pain. Sarah wept when she heard. Mark punched a hole in the drywall. By the end of the first week, exhaustion had set in for everyone. Volunteers thinned out as work and school resumed. The media. Circus packed up and moved on to the next story. But the police investigation pressed forward. Detectives canvassed every house within a mile of Value Mart, asking if anyone had security cameras, rare in 1991, or had noticed unfamiliar vehicles in the neighborhood in the days leading up to the disappearance. Registered sex offenders within a 100-mile radius were interviewed and alibied. Lieutenant Klein's team worked 18-hour days. They mapped every possible escape route from the parking lot, timed how long it would take to reach major highways, and checked toll booth records for white vans. They interviewed Sarah and Mark repeatedly, not because they suspected them, but because memory sharpens with time, and small details sometimes surface later. Sarah remembered the man in the gray jacket the cashier had mentioned. Mark recalled seeing a dark sedan circling the lot slowly when they arrived, but he hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Hope flickered, but it was fragile. Hey, if you're feeling the weight of those early days as much as I am, please show some love to the channel bringing you this story. Subscribe to Unsolved Stories so you don't miss the next part. Drop a like if this case is pulling at you, and share it with a friend who needs to hear it. Every share helps keep these forgotten cases in the light. Thank you. Next, we'll follow the investigation as it grows into a full-scale task force. Suspects questioned, alibis shattered, and leads that seemed promising crumbling into dust. The search for Timmy was only just beginning. 2 weeks after Timmy vanished, the Evergreen Police Department officially launched what would become one of the largest missing child investigations in Illinois history. Lieutenant Robert Klein's small team of detectives had grown into a full task force. The department's conference room was transformed into a war room, walls covered in maps, timelines, and hundreds of photographs. A giant corkboard dominated one side, Timmy's smiling face pinned at the center, with red string connecting leads, witness statements, and vehicle sightings. Phones rang constantly. Coffee pots were never empty. Sleep was a luxury no one could afford. The first priority was forensics. Although Value Mart had no security cameras covering the parking lot in 1991, only a few grainy indoor feeds near the registers, investigators brought in forensic teams to sweep every inch of the area where Timmy's scent trail had ended. Technicians dusted dozens of cars that had been parked nearby that morning, looking for fingerprints small enough to belong to a child. They vacuumed the asphalt for fibers, hair, anything that might have transferred during a struggle or a hurried abduction. Soil samples were taken from the grassy edge where the dogs lost the trail. Every item was bagged, labeled, and sent to the state crime lab in Springfield. Results trickled back slowly. A few blonde hairs were found in the vacuum debris, but they matched samples from Timmy's blanket, likely carried on his shoes or clothing. No blood, no signs of violence, no foreign fingerprints that couldn't be explained by the car owners themselves. While the lab worked, detectives hit the pavement. Every house within a 1-mile radius of the supermarket was visited, sometimes multiple times. Residents were asked if they'd noticed unfamiliar cars lingering in the neighborhood in the days before October 19th. Had anyone seen a white van, a gray sedan, or a man acting strangely? Door-to-door canvassing produced hundreds of statements, most of them useless, but a few stood out. A retired couple 3 blocks away remembered seeing a dark green Ford Bronco parked across from their house the previous Thursday and Friday. The driver, a white male in his late 30s with a baseball cap pulled low, sat inside for long stretches without getting out. When approached by the husband, the man drove off quickly. The partial plate they remembered, starting with K7, was run through DMV records. It returned dozens of possibilities across the state. Each one would need to be checked. Another neighbor, a young mother named Karen Ellis, told detectives she'd seen a man in a gray jacket watching children at the nearby playground on the Tuesday before the disappearance. He hadn't approached anyone, just sat on a bench smoking. Her description was vague, but it matched the vague description from the teenage bagger at Value Mart. Detectives also began pulling records on every registered sex offender within a 100-mile radius. There were 23 names. Alibis were checked one by one. Most had solid proof of where they'd been. Work time cards, family members, even parole officer visits. 3 had shaky alibis. Those 3 were brought in for lengthy interviews. The first was Ronald Decker, 42, a convicted child molester who had moved to a town 30 miles away after his release 6 months earlier. Decker worked nights at a warehouse and claimed to have been sleeping the morning of the abduction. No one could confirm it. He agreed to a polygraph. The results were inconclusive. He showed deception on questions about knowing Timmy, but polygraphs aren't admissible in court, and Decker's lawyer quickly shut down further questioning without a warrant. The second was Gerald Hines, 38, who had a history of exposing himself to children. Hines lived with his elderly mother 45 minutes from Evergreen. On the day Timmy vanished, he claimed to have been at a job interview in Chicago. The prospective employer confirmed the interview, but it had ended at 9:30 a.m., plenty of time to drive back. Hines refused a polygraph. Surveillance was quietly put on his house for weeks. Nothing suspicious emerged. The third suspect was more troubling. Martin Shaw, 35, had no prior child-related offenses, but he had a history of petty theft and forgery. Shaw lived alone in a trailer on the outskirts of Evergreen and worked odd jobs. Multiple neighbors reported seeing his white panel van, older model, rust along the wheel wells, parked near Value Mart several times in the weeks before the disappearance. Shaw claimed he shopped there regularly. On October 19th, he said he'd been home all day fixing a leaking roof. No one could corroborate it. When detectives searched his trailer with a warrant, they found stacks of missing child flyers from previous cases across the country, including some very old ones. Shaw insisted he collected them because he felt sorry for the families. Under intense questioning, he remained calm, never wavered from his story, and passed a polygraph with flying colors. Still, Klein kept him on the short list. As the task force dug deeper, they began looking at the family itself, standard procedure in any child disappearance, no matter how painful. Sarah and Mark were interviewed separately, multiple times. Their stories never changed. Both passed polygraphs. Their home was searched thoroughly. Nothing incriminating was found. Friends, co-workers, extended family, all were questioned. No motives surfaced, no custody disputes, no insurance policies taken out recently. The Thompsons were simply a normal, loving couple who had lost their only child. By early November, the FBI had fully embedded 2 agents with the task force. They brought in behavioral profilers from Quantico who analyzed the case file and concluded the abductor was likely a non-family opportunist, someone who had spotted a vulnerable moment and acted quickly. The lack of ransom demand suggested it wasn't financially motivated. The profilers warned that without new evidence, the case could go cold fast. Searches continued on a massive scale. The National Guard was called in for a weekend to grid search a 20-square-mile area around Evergreen. Helicopters with infrared cameras flew patterns at night. Rivers and lakes within driving distance were dragged. Abandoned farms and barns were checked. Cadaver dogs worked overtime. Every lead, no matter how small, was chased to the end. A truck stop waitress in Indiana called to say a man had come in with a little blonde boy who seemed scared. State police raced there, only to find the child was the man's own nephew visiting for the weekend, a construction worker. In Wisconsin, reported finding a child's red sneaker near a highway rest area. It was the right size, the right brand. The Thompsons were driven up to identify it. It wasn't Timmy's. The tread pattern was different. Each false alarm crushed the family anew. Thanksgiving came and went. The task force kept working, but the momentum was slowing. Tips were drying up. The media had moved on. Evergreen tried to return to normal, but Timmy's face still stared out from faded posters on telephone poles and store windows. Hey, if you're as invested in this investigation as I am right now, please take a moment to support the channel that's keeping this story alive. Subscribe to Unsolved Stories, hit that like button, and share this episode with someone who cares about missing children cases. Your shares truly make a difference. Sometimes tips come in years later because someone heard the story from a friend. Thank you for listening and for caring. Next, we'll follow the task force. As they widen the net even further, hundreds of interviews, polygraphs, stakeouts, and a flood of tip line calls that include some of the cruelest hoaxes imaginable. The search for Timmy Thompson was far from over, but the cracks were starting to show. As the harsh Illinois winter gave way to a muddy spring in 1992, the intense focus on suspects began to yield nothing but frustration. Martin Shaw, Ronald Decker, and Gerald Hines, the three men who had once seemed so promising, remained under quiet surveillance for months. Undercover officers followed their routines, Shaw to his odd jobs and church services, Decker to his night shifts at the warehouse and mandatory counseling sessions, Hines to his mother's house and occasional trips into town. Stakeouts lasted weeks at a time. Hidden cameras were placed near their homes. Phone lines were monitored with court approval. Nothing emerged. No late-night drives to remote areas. No suspicious purchases of children's clothing or toys. No contacts with known criminals. Their alibis, shaky as they had been, held up under repeated scrutiny. Neighbors reported nothing unusual. Slowly, painfully, the task force had to accept that these men, for all their red flags, were not the abductor. Resources were pulled back. Surveillance ended by early summer. The three names stayed in the file, but the leads attached to them were marked inactive. With the suspect pool drying up, attention shifted to the tip line, which had become both a lifeline and a curse. By mid-1992, the reward for information leading to Timmy had ballooned to $75,000, a combination of community fundraisers, corporate donations, and a sizable contribution from an anonymous businessman whose own child had gone missing years earlier. Billboards now carried the reward amount in bold letters beneath Timmy's photo. The increased money brought a fresh wave of calls, but the vast majority were opportunistic or outright cruel. One of the most elaborate hoaxes began in April. A man with a distorted voice called the tip line repeatedly over 2 weeks, claiming to be holding Timmy in a basement somewhere in southern Illinois. He described the boy's daily routine in chilling detail. What he ate for breakfast, the games they played, even a new scar Timmy supposedly had on his knee from falling. Each time, he demanded the reward be wired to various accounts before he would reveal the location. Police played along, stalling for traces. The calls bounced through payphones from St. Louis to Indianapolis. Finally, they pinpointed the caller, a 47-year-old unemployed mechanic with gambling debts. He admitted to inventing everything from news reports and photos. "I needed the money," he said flatly during arrest. Sarah heard about it and spent days in bed, unable to stop shaking. In June, a package arrived at the police station, a cassette tape labeled Timmy's Voice. When played, it featured a child crying, "Mommy," over and over, interspersed with a man's muffled commands. Audio experts analyzed it for hours. The child's voice was real, but it wasn't Timmy's. The pitch and accent didn't match samples from home videos. The recording had been spliced from old missing child documentaries. Another dead end. False sightings continued to pour in. A trucker swore he saw Timmy at a rest stop in Oklahoma with a couple in an RV. State police stopped every similar vehicle on that stretch of highway for days. Nothing. A teacher in Michigan reported a new student who looked exactly like the aged-up photos of Timmy circulated by the NSMEC. Social workers visited the home. The boy was the couple's biological child, born just weeks after Timmy's disappearance. The most heartbreaking leads involved discovered remains. In August 1992, construction workers unearthed a small skeleton while digging foundations for a new subdivision 25 miles from Evergreen. The bones were partially clothed in rotted fabric that included fragments of a blue shirt. News leaked before police could contain it. Reporters descended on the Thompson home. Sarah and Mark drove to the morgue, holding hands so tightly their knuckles turned white. Forensic anthropologists worked around the clock. Dental records were compared. It wasn't Timmy. The teeth showed dental work never done on him, and the estimated time of death predated the abduction by at least a year. 6 months later, in February 1993, ice fishermen on a frozen lake pulled up a child's red sneaker tangled in their line. Inside was a small foot bone. The lake was drained over weeks, a massive operation involving pumps and divers. More bones surfaced. The Thompsons waded through every update. DNA testing was still primitive and slow in 1993, but mitochondrial. Comparison was attempted with Sarah's sample. No match. The remains belonged to a child who had drowned accidentally in the late 1980s. Each discovery reignited media coverage briefly, then crushed the family anew when ruled out. Sarah began having panic attacks at the sound of the phone ringing. Mark took to long drives alone at night, circling the Value Mart parking lot under the floodlights, as if willing something to appear. By the 2-year mark in October 1993, the task force had been reduced to 2 full-time detectives reviewing incoming tips. Lieutenant Klein, now graying at the temples, still checked the file daily but admitted in private that new evidence was unlikely without a confession or a miracle. The command center room was dismantled. Boxes of reports were archived. The community moved on. New families shopped at Value Mart without knowing the history. Timmy's posters yellowed and peeled from telephone poles. The reward stayed posted, but calls dwindled to a handful per month. Mostly psychics or well-meaning but mistaken sightings. Sarah and Mark attended support groups for parents of missing children. They learned to live with the ambiguity, the not knowing that was worse than certainty for some. They kept Timmy's room untouched, a shrine to the 3-year-old who had vanished. Every October 19th, they held a quiet vigil at the supermarket, laying flowers where the scent trail had ended. The investigation never officially closed. A file remained open on a shelf in the Evergreen PD. But the frantic energy, the daily breakthroughs and breakdowns, it had faded into a quiet, aching cold case. In the next part, we'll follow the Thompson family through the long years ahead, the private searches, the emotional toll, the unexpected gift of new life, and the hope that somehow, somewhere, refused to die completely. The years after the investigation slowed were quiet on the outside, but inside the Thompson home, time moved in slow, painful circles. Sarah and Mark returned to a life that looked almost normal. Mark went back to the garage full-time, his hands steady on engines, but his mind often drifting. Customers noticed he sometimes stared too long at children brought in for oil changes, a faint smile crossing his face before he turned away. Sarah took a part-time job at a local library, surrounded by books and silence, places where she could sit for hours without anyone expecting her to speak. They attended church every Sunday, holding hands during prayers, though neither could say aloud what they prayed for anymore. Timmy's room remained exactly as it had been on October 19th, 1991. The bed was made with the same spaceship sheets. His red toy truck sat on the dresser, dust-free because Sarah wiped it every week. His tiny red sneakers, spares from before he vanished, were lined up by the door. Friends stopped suggesting they pack things away. They understood now. This was the only place Timmy still existed in physical form. Couple joined a support group for parents of missing children in Chicago, driving 2 hours each way every month. There, in a church basement with folding chairs and bad coffee, they listened to stories like their own. Some parents had answers, terrible ones. Others, like Sarah and Mark, lived in the limbo of not knowing. They learned phrases like ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief. They learned to nod when people said, "I can't imagine," because the truth was no one could. Holidays were the hardest. Christmas mornings without the sound of little feet thundering down the stairs. Birthdays, Timmy would have been 4, then 5, then 10, marked with a cake anyway, one candle lit and quickly blown out. Sarah kept buying clothes in the sizes he would have worn, folding them neatly in drawers she never opened in front of anyone else. They never stopped searching in their own quiet ways. Every few months, Sarah drove to neighboring states to put up new flyers, with age-progressed images created by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The drawings showed Timmy at 5, 8, 12, a blond boy with Mark's jawline and Sarah's eyes. She taped them to gas station windows, laundromats, Walmart bulletin boards. Most people barely glanced up. Some offered kind words. A few asked if there was still a reward. Mark built a small website in the late 1990s, one of the first for a missing child in their area. He taught himself basic HTML from library books, uploading Timmy's photos, the original flyer, and a guest book for tips. Messages trickled in over the years, mostly prayers, some false sightings, a few cruel ones that he deleted before Sarah could see them. The marriage strained but did not break. There were nights when Sarah woke screaming Timmy's name, nights when Mark sat on the back porch until dawn with a bottle he never quite finished. They fought sometimes, sharp, exhausted arguments about whether to keep the room untouched or finally let go. But more often, they simply held each other in the dark, two people clinging to the same sinking lifeboat. The shared pain, as unbearable as it was, became the strongest thread binding them. In 1997, 6 years after the disappearance, something unexpected happened. Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The news came as a shock. At 38, she had long ago stopped believing it possible. Doctors warned of risks, of her age, of the emotional weight she already carried. But the pregnancy progressed smoothly. On April 12, 1998, Emily Grace Thompson was born, a healthy girl with dark hair and eyes that shifted between blue and green depending on the light. Emily's arrival did not fix anything. Sarah felt guilt the first time she smiled at the baby without thinking of Timmy. Mark worried he wouldn't love another child the way he had loved his son. But slowly, gently, Emily carved out her own space in their hearts. She learned to walk in the hallway. Outside Timmy's closed door, she asked innocent questions. "Who's the little boy in the pictures?" And they answered as honestly as they could for a toddler. The family grew closer in ways they never anticipated. Emily became the bridge between past and present. Sarah read her the same books she had once read to Timmy. Mark built her a wooden playset in the backyard, sanding every edge smooth the way he once planned to do for a bigger swing set. They celebrated Emily's birthdays with real joy, even as they lit a separate candle for her missing brother. Emily grew up knowing Timmy's story, not as a dark secret, but as part of who they were. By the time she was in elementary school, she helped her parents update the website, scanning new age-progressed images. She understood, in the way only children in such families can, that love doesn't divide. It multiplies, even across absence. The case itself faded from public view. Occasional news segments aired on anniversaries, 10 years, 15, 20. A new detective would be assigned every few years, review the boxes, call Sarah and Mark with apologies that nothing had changed. Tips still came, fewer each year, but never zero. Everyone was checked. In 2004, a child's remains found in a wooded area near St. Louis sparked another agonizing cycle. Age and height roughly matched what Timmy would have been. Dental records were compared. Sarah flew out with Mark, waiting in a hotel room for 3 days. It wasn't him. The remains belonged to another long-missing boy, giving closure to a different family. In 2011, on the 20th anniversary, a news crew came to the house. Emily, now 13, sat beside her parents during the interview. She spoke quietly. "We still hope. We'll always hope." Sarah and Mark grew older. Gray touched their hair. Mark retired from the garage. Sarah volunteered at Emily's school, then at a crisis hotline for missing persons. They traveled sometimes, just the two of them, to places they had once imagined taking Timmy. National parks, Disney World, the Grand Canyon. They left a small red toy truck at every overlook, a silent message carried on the wind. Emily left for college in 2016, studying graphic design. She created new digital flyers, shared them on social media, kept the website alive. The family texted every day. Distance didn't weaken what they had built from ashes. Through it all, the question remained unanswered. No arrest, no body, no certainty. Yet somehow, amid the endless not knowing, they had learned to live. Not move on, never that, but to carry the weight together, to let love grow around the empty space rather than be consumed by it. Timmy would have been 30 years old in 2018. Sarah baked a small cake anyway. The three of them, Sarah, Mark, and Emily, sat at the kitchen table, lit one candle, and made the same silent wish they had made for decades. In the next part, we'll follow a discovery made far from evergreen, one born not of police work, but of simple human curiosity, that would finally begin to unravel the mystery after 31 long years. The decades rolled on, and the name Timmy Thompson gradually slipped from headlines into footnotes. By the early 2020s, most people in Evergreen under the age of 40 had never heard of the case. The Value Mart had been remodeled twice, the parking lot repaved, the spot where the scent trail ended now just an ordinary row of handicapped spaces. The old boxes of evidence gathered dust in a storage room at the police department, visited only when a new detective took over the cold case unit and felt obligated to flip through them. Sarah and Mark were in their 60s now. Mark's hands, once strong and sure on wrenches, had begun to tremble slightly from arthritis. Sarah's hair had gone silver, pulled back in the same simple ponytail she'd worn since the 1990s. Emily, their daughter, had married in 2021 and moved to Colorado with her husband, though she came home often. The house on Maple Street felt larger and quieter, but the three of them, Sarah, Mark, and the memory of Timmy, had learned to inhabit the silence together. Tips still arrived every few years. A decomposed child's remains discovered in a forest preserve in 2015. A boy matching an age-progressed image spotted in a viral TikTok video in 2019. A set of bones unearthed during highway construction in 2022. Each time, the process repeated. A phone call from a detective, a rush of adrenaline mixed with dread, samples submitted, weeks of waiting. Each time, the answer was the same: not Timmy. With every negative result, Sarah and Mark felt two things at once: crushing disappointment and a strange, guilty relief. Because as long as it wasn't him, the door stayed open. Their son could still be alive somewhere, living a life they couldn't imagine. They had long ago accepted that the truth might never come in their lifetime. Yet hope, stubborn and irrational, refused to leave. In the spring of 2022, more than 31 years after the disappearance, something shifted, not in Evergreen, but nearly 600 miles away in a small city in northern Texas. Jacob Harlan was 34 years old, a high school history teacher and assistant coach for the varsity baseball team. He was 6'1", broad-shouldered, with sandy blonde hair he kept trimmed short, and a quiet, easygoing manner that made students like him. He had grown up in a modest ranch-style house on the outskirts of town, the only child of Richard and Diane Harlan. His parents were older when they brought him home. Richard was 52, Diane 49, and they had doted on him fiercely. They'd told him early on that he was adopted privately through a lawyer, a common enough story in the 1980s. Jacob never felt the need to dig deeper. He loved his parents. They loved him. That was enough. But in recent years, casual conversations with colleagues about ancestry and heritage had sparked a mild curiosity. Friends showed him their DNA results, pie charts of Scandinavian or West African or indigenous ancestry, and Jacob wondered what his own would say. For Christmas 2021, he bought himself a consumer DNA kit from one of the popular genealogy companies. He spat into the tube, mailed it off, and mostly forgot about it. The results arrived in April 2022. Jacob opened the app on his phone during his planning period at school. The ethnicity estimate was unremarkable, mostly British and Irish, some German, a little Scandinavian. He scrolled past it to the DNA matches. Close family members should have appeared first. Parents, perhaps an aunt or uncle. Instead, the top match was listed as close family, first cousin, or similar. The name attached was Sarah Thompson, age 63, location Evergreen, Illinois. Estimated relationship: parent-child. Jacob stared at the screen for a long time. His heart began to pound. He clicked through to the shared DNA amount, over 3,400 centimorgans. That wasn't a cousin. That was the range for a parent and child. He went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table with his parents. Richard was watching a baseball game. Diane was folding laundry. Jacob placed his phone in front of them, the match open. "Mom. Dad. I think something's wrong." Diane looked at the screen, then at Jacob, confusion turning to unease. Richard muted the television. Jacob asked the question gently but directly. "Did you adopt me through a lawyer, or was there someone else involved?" The room went still. Diane's hands trembled as she set down a towel. Richard cleared his throat twice before speaking. "We always told you the truth as we knew it," he said slowly. "We couldn't have children. A man approached us in 1989, said he knew of a private adoption opportunity. We met a woman who acted as intermediary. We paid a large sum, everything we'd saved. And a few weeks later, she brought us a baby boy, you. We signed papers. We were told the birth mother wanted no contact. We never questioned it further. We were just so grateful." Jacob listened, his stomach knotting. He asked to see the adoption papers. They were sparse, barely legal, notarized by an attorney who had long since retired. No birth certificate with his biological parents' names. Just a document stating he had been relinquished voluntarily. That night, Jacob couldn't sleep. He searched the name Sarah Thompson online. The first result was a missing child website, still active after all these years. The banner photo showed a faded flyer. "Have you seen Timmy?" Below it, age-progressed images. One of them looked eerily like a younger version of himself. Same eyes, same mouth, same slight dimple in the chin. He read the entire story in one sitting. The supermarket parking lot, the phone call, the vanished 3-year-old, born the same year as him, same month even, Evergreen, Illinois, hundreds of miles from where he'd grown up. Jacob sat back, hands shaking. The room spun. Over the next days, he reached out cautiously through the Genealogy site's messaging system to Sarah. He didn't want to shatter anyone's world without being sure. But the shared matches kept growing. Mark Thompson appeared, then Emily Thompson, listed as sibling. Sarah received the first message on a quiet Tuesday morning while watering plants on the porch. The subject line read, "Possible close family match, Jacob Harlan." She opened it, read the careful, respectful words from a man who said he'd recently tested and found an unexpected parent-child connection to her. He attached a photo. Sarah dropped the watering can. Soil spilled across the wooden boards. The face staring back at her was older, bearded, but unmistakable. It was Timmy, grown into a man. She called Mark at work. Her voice broke as she tried to explain. Mark left the garage immediately, speeding home. Together they read every message, studied every photo Jacob sent. The resemblance was undeniable. The DNA numbers didn't lie. They arranged a video call that weekend. When Jacob's face filled the screen, tall, kind eyes, the same nervous half-smile Timmy used to give when caught sneaking cookies, Sarah began to cry silently. Mark gripped her hand so hard it hurt. Emily joined from Colorado, tears streaming as she whispered, "Hi, big brother." Jacob told them about his life, the parents who had raised him with love, the small-town Texas childhood, baseball scholarships, teaching history to teenagers who reminded him daily how precious ordinary days were. He had questions, so many, but he asked them gently, giving Sarah and Mark space to absorb the impossible. The pieces fell together slowly. Richard and Diane Harlan, devastated by their own realization, cooperated fully. They had never suspected the child wasn't legally relinquished. The intermediary, a woman whose name they remembered, had vanished years ago. But the money trail, faint as it was after 3 decades, still existed in old bank records. Police in Texas and Illinois were notified. Detectives, many too young to remember the original case, reopened the file with a mixture of shock and excitement. Jacob, Timmy, provided a new DNA sample for official confirmation. The match was 99.999%. In the next part, we'll follow the reopened investigation as it races along fresh paths, uncovering a long-dormant child abduction network, and finally, the moment an entire family waited 31 years to experience. The revelation from Jacob's DNA test in 2022 sent shockwaves through the Thompson family, but it was only the beginning of a long, emotional unraveling. For 31 years, the case had been a shoe, Ghost, whispered about in cold case podcasts, occasionally dusted off for anniversary articles, but largely forgotten by the world. Now, with a living match staring back from a genealogy database, the file was yanked from the archives and thrust into the light. Detectives in Evergreen, many of whom hadn't even been born when Timmy vanished, scrambled to reassemble the puzzle. The original Lieutenant Klein had retired years ago, but he was called in as a consultant, his voice cracking with emotion when Sarah phoned him personally. "I never stopped believing," he told her. The FBI re-engaged, assigning a fresh team to coordinate between Illinois and Texas. Jacob, still struggling to wrap his mind around his true identity, agreed to every test and interview. Official DNA from cheek swabs confirmed what the consumer kit had hinted. He was Timmy Thompson, taken at 3, raised under a new name by unwitting adoptive parents. Richard and Diane Harlan were questioned gently. They were elderly now, Diane in failing health, but they provided every detail they could recall about the adoption. The intermediary woman, described as middle-aged with short brown hair and a slight limp, had used the name Maria Lopez, but records showed it was likely an alias. The payment, $40,000 in cash in 1991, had been handed over in a motel parking lot near Dallas. Tracing that money became the key. Bank records from the Harlans showed withdrawals matching the timeline. Detectives followed the trail to a defunct law firm in Oklahoma, where the notary had worked. The attorney was deceased, but his old files stored in a dusty warehouse revealed patterns, multiple private adoptions with similar vague paperwork, all involving cash payments and no birth records. This wasn't an isolated abduction. It was part of a ring. Investigators widened the net. They cross-referenced unsolved child disappearances from the late 1980s and early 1990s with suspicious adoptions. In the Southwest, patterns emerged: babies and toddlers taken from public places, sold to childless couples desperate enough not to ask questions. The ring had operated across state lines: Illinois, Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas, evading detection by keeping transactions low-key and paperwork just legal enough to pass muster. One breakthrough came from a retired Oklahoma cop who remembered a similar case in 1990. A 2-year-old girl vanished from a playground, later adopted by a family in Kansas. The intermediary matched the Harlans' description. Using facial recognition on old DMV photos, they identified Maria Lopez as Margaret Lowe, a 68-year-old woman living in a nursing home in Tulsa. Lowe, suffering from dementia, confessed fragments during interviews. She'd worked as a middleman for a small network led by a man named Victor Ruiz, a former social worker turned trafficker. Ruiz had died in 2005, but his associates were still alive. Arrests followed quickly. 2 men, in their 70s, one in Missouri, one in Texas, were charged with multiple counts of child trafficking and kidnapping. They had preyed on distracted parents in stores, parks, malls, opportunistic grabs that mirrored Timmy's case exactly. The white van sightings from 1991? Likely one of theirs, though the specific vehicle had long since been scrapped. Evidence piled up, faded receipts, witness testimonies from other adoptive families who came forward once the story broke nationally. Not all couples knew the children were stolen. Many, like the Harlans, believed they were helping a mother in need. But the ring had profited hundreds of thousands, exploiting desperation on both sides. For the Thompsons, the legal whirlwind was secondary to the personal one. Jacob visited Evergreen for the first time in June 2022. Sarah and Mark met him at the airport, hearts pounding like teenagers. When Jacob stepped through the gate, tall with Timmy's eyes, they enveloped him in a hug that lasted minutes. No words at first, just tears and the feel of a son returned. Over the following weeks, they pieced together his life. Jacob showed photos of his Texas childhood, little league games, high school graduation, his wedding to a kind woman named Laura in 2015. They had 2 young children of their own. Grandkids Sarah and Mark never dreamed they'd meet. Emily flew in, embracing her brother with fierce protectiveness. "You're home now," she whispered. Jacob grappled with the duality. He loved the Harlans. They were mom and dad in every way that mattered. But learning about the abduction shattered him. Therapy sessions helped. Family dinners in Evergreen bridged the gap. The Harlans, heartbroken but understanding, even joined a video call once, tears flowing as they apologized for a crime they hadn't known they were part of. Media descended again. CNN, Dateline, podcasts. Everyone wanted the story of the boy lost and found after 3 decades. The Thompsons spoke, sparingly, focusing on joy rather than pain. "We never gave up," Sarah said in one interview, Jacob's hand in hers. The trial for the surviving traffickers dragged on into 2023. Convictions came, life sentences without parole, justice late but real. But the true closure was quieter. On October 19, 2022, the 31st anniversary, Jacob stood in the Value Mart parking lot with his family. He touched the asphalt where his scent had ended as a toddler. "I'm here now," he said softly. Sarah laid flowers, not in mourning but in gratitude. The family expanded. Holidays swelled with new voices, Jacob's kids calling Sarah grandma, Mark teaching them to fix toy cars. Emily's own pregnancy announcement in 2023 added another layer of light. Timmy Thompson, Jacob Harlan, had come home, not as the 3-year-old they lost, but as the man he had become. And in that reunion, after 31 years of shadows, the Thompsons found not just their son, but a future they thought forever stolen. This concludes the story. Thank you for listening to Unsolved Stories, though this one, miraculously, found its resolution. If it moved you, please subscribe, like, and share so more tales like this reach those who need them.